Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking about HTML inputs and the various ways that you can get users to enter information onto your website. And then we're going to be using DOM JavaScript to get the values that the users have entered so we can do what we want with them. Let's hop into it. So inputs are the primary way that you'll have your users enter information into your website. So first let's talk about our file setup. Right here, all we have are two files inside of my inputs folder. We have index.html as well as script.js. And I made sure to have this script tag at the bottom of the body of my index.html in order to link the two. Now my script.js is currently empty, and the only thing that I have on my index.html is this h1 tag that says inputs. If you go ahead and open that up in the browser, then you'll see that that's the only thing that's rendered on the page. Now the new tag that we're going to talk about today is called an input tag. And there are several different types of inputs, and we'll be talking about how to create those different inputs on your web page, as well as how to get those values in your JavaScript. For each of these different types of inputs, the tag is going to be the same. However, the type attribute is what's going to be important in determining how the user enters their information. So for example, we'll talk about our first input type, text. If we say type is text, and we save this and we go back to our HTML and we refresh, we see we have this text input right here. And I can go ahead and type in whatever I want. Now that's a way that you can get the user to type text inputs in here. However, there are many other types of inputs, such as checkbox. And if we go ahead and create that, then we'll see that here we have a checkbox input. You can either have it toggled on or you can have it toggled off. Now the important thing about inputs is that they also have labels associated with them. So to add a label to this input, you need to add two things. The first one is going to be a name attribute to your input. We'll just name this first name. This can be whatever you want it to be. And then the label tag will have an attribute called for. And that for attribute has to match the name on the input. So in this case, it will be for first name. And then we'll just put the label in between the opening and closing tags for label. Go ahead and save that. And if we refresh our page, we'll see that this text input now has the label first name. Now if we wanted to add a label to our checkbox, then what we can do is go down here and let's add an HR as a divider. And here we could do label for, and we need to give this input a name attribute as well. We'll just give this the name male, and this will be a label for male. And inside of here we can give it the label male. And because this is a male checkbox, let's go ahead and create a female checkbox as well. We need to make sure that the for attribute on label matches the name attribute on the input. And then whatever goes inside of the label tags is what shows up on the web page. So if we go ahead and refresh our page, we have two checkboxes. This first one is male and the second one is female, and they have their associating labels with them. Now those are just two different types of inputs, but there are also other popular text inputs. For example, if we wanted to create a way for a user to enter a password and you didn't want to display that password in the UI, then what you could do is you could create another input, but this type is going to be called password. And let's give it the name password, and let's also give it a label. And if we save this and refresh our page, we have a first name input where I can type whatever I want. And then we also have a password input. But you can see when I type into it, whatever I'm typing shows up hidden. The last popular type of text input that I want to talk about is a text area. And this one's going to look a little different because it doesn't use the input tags. Instead, it has its own tag, and it's going to be text area. So while the text area tags look different than the input tags, they operate the same way. So here, inside of the text area, let's go ahead and let's create a name for it. And let's just name it description. And this can be named whatever you want. And then let's create a label tag again and do for description. And description will also be the label. So if we go ahead and save this, then we'll see we now have this text area. And the nice thing about it is you can resize it based on whatever you type in here. And it will be larger than just a normal text input. Now let's talk about how we get the values that the user types inside of these various inputs. So to do that, we're going to have to write some JavaScript code. Now in the last video, remember how we talked about event listeners. So what we can do is we can create a button. And when you click on the button, the JavaScript code goes and reads the values out of the inputs. Now in order to do that, each of our inputs is going to first have to have an ID. So let's go ahead and give some ID tags to each of these. This one will just be first name. And then the ID tag of the password can be password. And the ID of this text area, let's just name it text area. So now that our three different types of text inputs have IDs, let's go ahead and let's create a button. And that button is going to have an event listener. And that event listener is going to read the values out of the inputs. So this button also needs to have an ID, we'll just give it ID of submit button, and we'll give it the label of get values. So if we go ahead and refresh that in the UI, then we see we now have this get values button at the bottom. Right now it doesn't do anything. So let's go over to our script.js and let's add an event listener. So first we need to get our button element. So that will be document.getElementById. And we gave our button the ID of submit button. Next we have to do .add event listener, and it's going to be a click event. And then we have our second parameter, which is a function, and that's going to describe what we want to happen. So inside of this function, what we're going to do is we're going to read the values out of the text inputs and then just console.log them into the console of our browser. In the DOM JavaScript video, we talked about how we could create new elements on the page and also manipulate elements that already exist on the page. So essentially, instead of just printing out the values to the console, you could do any of those things as well. So now that we have our event listener, let's go ahead and read the first value out of the first name. So to do that, we have to do document.getElementById, and it's going to be the ID of first name, which is the ID of our text input element. And then the attribute that we want to grab off of this element is just going to be .value. So now if we create a variable, so we'll just say let first name equal document.getElementById first name.value, then this first name variable should now have the value that's inside of that text input. We can verify this by doing console.log first name. So now let's save this and let's verify that this works. So if we go back to our browser and we refresh, let's open up our console using the inspector and going to the console tab here. And now let's type in a first name, Kanye. And if we hit get values, then you see that we print out first name, which is the label that we set, and Kanye. However, if I type something in the password and I hit get values, we still only get Kanye. And the reason is because we haven't grabbed the value out of the password input as well. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll do let password equal document.getElementById, and instead this is going to be password.value. And this is because this ID right here matches the password ID that we set on this input in the HTML. And now if we go ahead and let's console.log password as well, and we save that and refresh, now if we type in a name here and we type in a password and we hit get values, we can see the first name is Kanye and the password that I typed in is blah. So in the UI, you can't see the value that I typed, but in the console, because it can grab the value of the input, we can paste out that value. Now the last one is just description, and as you can imagine, it would probably be the same thing. Let's go ahead and say let textarea equal document.getElementById textarea, because that is the ID that we set for our text area in our index.html. And then let's go ahead and console.log textarea as well. Go ahead and save that, refresh, and now let's try Kanye, password, and then this is a description. Go ahead and get values, and now we have all three values from all three different text inputs. An example of how we could change some elements in the DOM is if instead of just printing it to the console, let's go ahead and actually change the inner HTML of one of our elements. So let's go here, and underneath our button, let's go ahead and create a p tag, and our p tag won't have any text, but we'll make sure to give it an ID, and we'll just call it result. So now if we go back to our script.js, and let's go ahead and let's build a string that we want to be the text in between that p tag. So let's create a variable, we'll just call it sentence, and we'll set that equal to my first name is, and we'll make sure to append the first name variable, and then we'll say my password is, and then we'll append the password variable. And then lastly, we'll say my description is, and we'll append the text area. So now that we have our sentence, we can do document.getElementById, and the ID of our p tag is result. And then we can set .innerHTML equal to sentence. So if we go ahead and save this, not only is it going to print to the console, but it will also change the inner HTML of the p tag that's below this get values. If we go to our elements down here, we'll see that underneath our button, we have this p tag. And the p tag right now does not have any text inside of it. However, as soon as I add a first name, password, and description, and I hit get values, we'll see that we change the inner HTML of this p tag to now have this text inside of it. And this text is exactly the sentence that we built in our JavaScript. Some other inputs that you can try are date inputs. And for that, we'll make sure that the type is date, and we'll give it the name of my date, and make sure that the for matches the name attribute. And then we'll also give it an ID of my date. And now if we go ahead into our script.js, let's go ahead and create a new variable. We'll call it my date, and we'll set that equal to document.getElementById, and we'll put the ID my date inside. And if we want to get the value, let's go ahead and console log my date. And if we go ahead and refresh our page, we see that now we have this date input here. And this date input, it has this nice drop down where you can go ahead and select a date this way, or you could manually type it in if you'd like to instead. And then if you hit get values and we go and take a look inside our console, we'll see that the first name, password, and text area are empty. And this right here is a string that represents the value of the date that we entered in the date input. Now, just like date, we can also do time. So instead of my date, let's just change them all to say time. And then in our script.js, let's go ahead and let's get the time value instead. If we save and refresh, then we see we now have this time input as well, and you can select a time on here. And if we get values, we'll see that the time is exported as military time. We can also restrict the type of text input to be a number. So instead of type text, we can change it to type number. In this case, we'll call this my number. And if we go into our script.js, inside of our event listener, let's go ahead and get the value of my number. If we go ahead and refresh the page, we see that this value right here looks like a normal text input. However, it now has these arrows. Here we can click the up arrow to increment and the down arrow to decrement the value of the number. Now if I try to type a letter in this text input, nothing shows up. Values will only show up if I type numbers into it. And then if we type get values, we'll see that my number is this string value right here. Now another type of input that you guys might be familiar with is a dropdown. However, in HTML, a dropdown is actually called a select. And so just like with textarea, instead of using the input tag, it has its own tag called select. Now inside the select tags, similar to an ordered list or an unordered list, you provide the different options that you want in the dropdown. And in order to do that, you just need to use an option tag. And in between the option is the label that you want that dropdown to have. So in this case, if we were trying to select different types of cars, then one of the options could be a Hyundai. Another option could be a Ford, and the last option could be a Toyota. Now these option tags need to have a value attribute associated with it. And this value attribute is actually the value that's going to get returned when we get the value of the select input. So here we'll just do Hyundai, this one will be Ford, and this one will be Toyota. And we also have to give our select an ID and a name. And here for our label, we'll say it's for cars, which is the name that we gave to our select input, and then we'll change the label to say car. So if we go ahead and refresh this, we'll now see that we have this drop-down option for car. And we can select any of these that we want. Now if we want to get that value in our JavaScript, we have to go ahead and do getElementById.value again. This time we set our ID to car, and down here we'll just console.log my car. Save this, refresh our page, and if we go ahead and let's select Toyota and we hit get values, then we'll see that my car is given the value of Toyota, which is the lowercase Toyota, which has the lowercase t. And that is because in our index.html, we set this option of Toyota to have the value of lowercase t Toyota, whereas the label of the option is uppercase T Toyota. Now the reason that I waited until the end to talk about checkboxes is because for checkboxes and radio buttons, you actually don't use .value to get the value of it. Instead, you have to use .checked. So in this case, if we wanted to see if the male and or the female checkboxes were checked, then we would have to use .checked. So let's go ahead and let's give these two inputs IDs. This one will be ID male, and this one will be ID female. So if we go back here to our script.js, let's create two more variables, one for male and one for female. But instead of value, we're going to change this to be checked instead. And then down here, let's just console.log male and female. If we save this and refresh our page, then we'll see that our male and female are unchecked. And if we click get values, we see male and female are both false. If I go ahead and check male and I click get values, then you see male is true, but female is still false. And lastly, if I check male and female and click get values, you can see both of them become true. So checkboxes do not spit out the value that's on the label, it spits out a true or false Boolean value. And the same goes for radio buttons. So the difference between checkboxes and radio buttons is that with radio buttons, only one of them can be selected, whereas checkboxes you can select multiple. So let's go ahead and let's create a radio button input. So if we go to input, we'll do type equals radio, and here we'll set the name attribute equal to color, and then we'll give it the ID of red. Let's go ahead and create a label for this, and this time this label is going to be red. And then down here, let's create some more input and labels with different colors. So this one will be blue, and this last one will be green. Now the way that the radio button knows that only one of these can be selected is because they all have the same name attribute. So even though the IDs are different, red, blue, and green, because they have the same name attribute, only one of these will be allowed to be selected at any given time. So if we go ahead and save this and refresh our page, we see that we have our radio buttons down here at the bottom. I can select red, but as soon as I select blue, you'll see that the red one unchecks itself. If I select green, then the blue one unchecks itself. So only one of these can be selected at any given time. Now, just like with checkboxes, in order to get the value that's selected, what we'll have to do is .checked. Let's go ahead and create 3 more variables. We'll create red, we'll create blue, and we'll create green. And then let's also create 3 more console logs. And this will be red, blue, and green. So if we save this and go back to our website and we refresh, let's select blue. And if we hit get values, then we'll see that red and green are false, but blue is true. If we select red this time and we click get values, then we'll see that red is true and blue and green are false. So this covers the most common inputs that you see on websites today and how to get their respective values. In order to do that, we had to set up event listeners as well as use DOM JavaScript. Since we went through a lot of different input type tags, I'll make sure to leave a link in the description which has a link to this code on GitHub, so you can reference it when you start using these inputs on your own website. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching all the way until the end, and I'll see you guys in the next one.